ignored. Iran has lashed out across the region. They've launched hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones at countries which did not attack them, including the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, Bahrain and Oman. And overnight, Hezbollah, Iran's proxy in Lebanon, launched attacks on Israel, seeking to escalate the war. Mr. Speaker, there are an estimated 300,000 British citizens in the region, residents, families on holiday, and those in transit. Iran has hit airports and hotels where British citizens are staying. It is deeply concerning for the whole House and the whole country. And, Mr. Speaker, our armed forces are also being put at risk by Iran's actions. On Saturday, Iran hit a military base in Bahrain with missiles and drones. There were 300 British personnel on the base, some within a few hundred yards of the strike. Last night, a drone hit RAF Fairford in Cyprus. There were no casualties in this strike. Mr. Speaker, it is important for me to say that our bases in Cyprus are not being used by US bombers. The security of our friends and partners in Cyprus is of critical importance. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear. The strike on RAF Fairford in Cyprus was not in response to any decision that we have taken. In our assessment, the drone was launched prior to our announcement. Iran's aggression towards Britain and our interests is long-standing, and that's why we've always ensured that protections for British bases and personnel are at their highest level. Mr. Speaker, it is very clear that the death of the Supreme Leader will not stop Iran from launching these strikes. In fact, their approach is becoming even more reckless and more dangerous to civilians. They are working ruthlessly and deliberately through a plan to strike not only military targets, but also economic targets in the region, with no regard for civilian casualties. That is the situation we face today, and to which we must respond. Mr. Speaker, I've been speaking to our Gulf partners over the weekend. They're outraged by Iran's acts, particularly as they played no part in any strikes, and they've asked us to do more to defend them. Moreover, it is my duty, the highest duty of my office, to protect British lives. That is why we put British jets in the air, Typhoons and F-35s, as part of coordinated defensive operations, which have already successfully intercepted Iranian strikes, including, Mr. Speaker, taking out one drone that was heading towards a coalition base in Iraq, housing UK service personnel. I want to pay tribute to our brilliant servicemen and women, putting themselves in harm's way to keep others safe. And I know the whole House will join me in expressing our gratitude and our respect. But, Mr. Speaker, it is simply not possible to shoot down every Iranian missile and every drone after they've been launched. The only way to stop the threat is to destroy the missiles at source, in their storage depots or at the launchers. The US requested permission to use British bases for that specific and limited defensive purpose, because they had the capabilities to do so. Yesterday evening, we took the decision to accept that new request in order to prevent Iran firing missiles across the region, killing innocent civilians, putting British lives at risk, and hitting countries that have not been involved. To be clear, the use of British bases is limited to the agreed defensive purposes, we are not joining the US and Israeli offensive strikes. The basis for our decision is the collective self-defence of long-standing friends and allies and protecting British lives. It is in accordance with international law, and we've produced a summary of our legal advice which clearly sets this out. We will keep the decision under review. Mr. Speaker, we are not joining the strikes, but we will continue our defensive actions in the region. France and Germany are also prepared to enable US action to destroy Iran's capability to fire missiles and drones from source. I've been in close contact with President Macron and Chancellor Merz in recent days, as well as President Trump and leaders across the region to that end. Mr. Speaker, be in no doubt, the regime in Iran is utterly abhorrent. In January, they murdered thousands of their own people, the full horror of which is still hidden from the world. For decades, they have sought to destabilise the region and export terror around the world. Their proxies in Yemen have targeted British ships in the Red Sea. They facilitated Russia's attacks in Ukraine. The regime's tentacles have even reached these shores, posing a direct threat to Iranian dissidents and to the Jewish community. Over the last year alone, Iran has backed more than 20 potentially lethal attacks on UK soil, each of which, Mr. Speaker, we have foiled. So it's clear the Iranian regime must never be allowed to get their hands on nuclear weapons. That remains the primary aim of the United Kingdom and our allies, including the US, and ultimately this will have to be achieved at the negotiating table. Mr. Speaker, in this dangerous moment, our first thoughts are with our citizens in the region, friends, family members and constituents. I recognise the deep concern that the situation is causing for those involved and for communities across the country. We're asking all British citizens in the region to register their presence so we can provide the best possible support, and to monitor the Home Office travel advice, which is being regularly updated. Across much of the region, airspace remains closed, and local authorities are advising individuals to shelter in place. The situation on the ground may remain challenging for some time, so we're sending rapid deployment teams to the region to support our British nationals on the ground. And we're in close contact with the travel industry and governments in the region, including with our friends in the UAE, given the concentration of British nationals in that country. And we're looking at all options to support our people. We want to ensure that they can return home as swiftly and safely as possible. The FCDO phone lines are open to provide consular support, and ministers are available to meet MPs to discuss any individual cases. Mr. Speaker, we're also reaching out to communities across the United Kingdom, including Muslim and Jewish community organisations, and we're making sure that sites across the country, including places of worship, have appropriate protective security in place. Mr. Speaker, the situation in the region is developing rapidly, so we will continue to update the House in coming days. Mr. Speaker, I've spoken recently about the toll that global events are taking here at home. They come crashing into our lives with ever greater frequency, hitting our economy, driving up prices on the supermarket shelves or at the pump, dividing communities, bringing anxiety and fear. That's why how we operate on the world stage matters so much. Mr. Speaker, we all remember the mistakes of Iraq, and we have learned those lessons. Any UK actions must always have a lawful basis and a viable, thought-through plan. I say again, we were not involved in the initial strikes on Iran, and we will not join offensive action now. But in the face of Iran's barrage of missiles and drones, we will protect our people in the region and support the collective self-defence of our allies, because that is our duty to the British people. It is the best way to eliminate the urgent threat, to prevent the situation spiralling further, and support a return to diplomacy. It is the best way to protect British interests and British lives. That is what this government is doing, and I commend this statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Bednall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and for the security briefing I received earlier. This is a defining moment for the people of Iran, the wider Middle East and the world order. I know that hundreds of thousands of British people still in the region, many sheltering from drone attacks, are fearful about making it home. I agree with the Prime Minister that everyone in the region should follow FCDO advice and register their presence with the British Embassy. Can the Prime Minister confirm whether he is making contingency plans for a potential evacuation of UK citizens and what stage the operational planning is at? Let me also, Mr. Speaker, pay tribute to our brave service personnel stationed in British bases in the region. I know that this will be an anxious time for them and their families. They all have our support. Mr. Speaker, we stand in solidarity with our allies, including Bahrain, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, who, along with others, have been on the receiving end of unprovoked aggression. On Saturday, our allies, the United States and Israel, took targeted action against the Iranian regime. A regime which for decades has been brutally repressing its own citizens, whose leader had the blood of hundreds of thousands of Iranians on his hands and of countless others around the world killed by Iranian proxies. This regime is the world's foremost sponsor of international terrorism. It seeks to annihilate the world's only Jewish state. It has said so repeatedly, and we should take despots at their word. It is a regime whose apparatchiks chant death to Britain. It has attacked British nationals and conducted multiple plots on British soil, as the head of MI5 has warned. It is manufacturing drones en masse for Russia, drones which are raining down on innocent Ukrainians. And it continues to try to develop nuclear weapons in flagrant violation of international agreement, nuclear weapons which, if obtained, would be an existential threat for this country. The outcome of Ayatollah Khamenei's death will, we hope, be a safer Middle East and a safer world, with the future of Iran back in the hands of the Iranian people. But that outcome is not yet guaranteed. On Saturday, our allies in Canada and Australia immediately backed the action taken by America against this despotic regime in Tehran. And I have made it very clear that the Conservative Party also stands behind America taking this necessary action against state-sponsored terror. But over the weekend, statements from the government and the Prime Minister provided no such clarity. It was only last night that the Prime Minister finally told us that the government would allow our allies the use of our own air bases, despite it being obvious that UK interests were under imminent threat. It took Iranian missiles hitting allies in the Gulf before he finally made a decision. And even after that, the Foreign Secretary said this morning that the government has put limits on the actions of our allies operating from our bases. Unbelievably, in his statement today, the Prime Minister still cannot say whether he backs the strikes or not. Today, the President of the United States has taken the extraordinary step of rebuking the Prime Minister publicly, saying he took far too long to grant access. We are told that this dither and delay is because of concerns over international law, but I am afraid that explanation simply does not hold. International law didn't prevent our allies from clearly and unequivocally stating whose side they were on. You don't need international law to say whose side you're on. It has not prevented British governments in the past from supporting strikes which we knew to be right. As the Shadow Attorney General has said, if the doctrines of international law are unable to restrain Iranian terrorism and mass murder, if they tie the hands of democracies while forcing us to stand and watch Iranian atrocities, international law will have failed. It will have become a fundamentally immoral system of law. Why is it that under this Prime Minister, international law always seems to be at odds with our national interest? Why is it that we are giving away? Why is it that we are giving away the Chagos Islands and paying £35 billion for the privilege rather than standing up for our national interest and protecting the crucial military base which even now our allies are using? We in this House are elected to stand up for Britain's national interest, and where the government is doing the right thing, we will always back them. So let me reiterate our offer that if the government brings forward legislation to fast-track banning the IRGC, we will support them. But let me ask the Prime Minister, what national interest was served refusing to help our allies for so long, particularly when we so need American support to protect Ukraine's and Europe's security? Are we going to see new UK military capabilities deployed to protect our security partners, our bases, including in Cyprus, and British nationals in the region? And will the Prime Minister ensure the Chancellor uses the Spring Statement tomorrow to set Britain on a clear path to 3% of GDP on defence spending? There is no point wanting action to make the world a safer place, but being too scared to do anything except stand by and watch others. Mr. Speaker, our national interest and national security must be front and centre. The Conservative Party will always work with our allies to make the world a safer place.
Mr. Speaker, she asked about contingency plans for UK nationals, and I can assure her and the House we're working at speed with our partners in the region to take whatever measures we can to make sure that our people can return as safely and as swiftly as possible, and will continue to do so. And I'm happy to update her and the House as we roll out those plans. Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear. There were two distinct and separate decisions over the weekend. The first decision was whether or not the United Kingdom should join the US-Israel offensive against Iran. We took the decision that we should not. We should not.
Absolutely right.
The second decision was a separate decision, and actually a separate request from the US, which was whether we should permit the use of bases for the distinct, specific, defensive purpose of collective self-defence of our allies and to protect British lives, which were put at risk by the actions of Iran on Saturday and Sunday. We took the decision that we should do so. I am clear in my mind that any UK action must always have a lawful basis. It must also always have a viable and thought-through plan.
Yes.
And it must be in our national interest.
Yes.
The Leader of the Opposition, I think, is saying she would have joined the initial strikes whether they were lawful or not. I noticed she didn't say, the Shadow Attorney General said they would have been lawful, just that the law should be changed.
Yes.
And I think she said they would have joined the initial strikes without regard to whether they had a plan. She was very critical of us not joining sooner. Therefore, it's impossible to have that position without arguing that we should and we could have joined. I fundamentally disagree. Mr. Speaker, I will tell the House why. Where our military personnel take action, putting their lives at risk, it is our duty, my duty, to ensure they have a lawful basis. Yeah. On Saturday, we deployed UK pilots into the sky in the region, and they've been working there ever since. They deserve to know that their actions are lawful and there is a viable, thought-through plan. And I will not countenance committing our military personnel to action which doesn't have a lawful basis. That is not a fair thing to do to our serving personnel. And no UK Prime Minister has ever committed our personnel to action unless it's got a proper lawful basis.
In this select committee, Dame Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Although the attack on Iran by the US and Israel was ill-advised, ill-judged and illegal, it is absolutely no excuse for the Iranians to recklessly bombard its Gulf neighbours. I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, is he in a position to give us more details on what we're doing with our Ukrainian friends to support the collective self-defence of Arab nations against the Iranian Shahid drones that are causing so much damage in Ukraine and now in the Gulf?
Can I thank her for that question, because it is an important question. Ukraine, sadly, has more expertise than anyone in dealing with drones, and that's why we're putting their expertise and our expertise together and using it to help our allies in the region as they struggle with drones as we speak.
Sir Ed David, Leader of the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement for my security briefing. Once again, President Trump has launched a unilateral and unlawful act. Ayatollah Khamenei was a brutal dictator and a monstrous war criminal. He supported Hamas and their October the 7th atrocities, and he massacred thousands of his own people for daring to protest against decades of repression. I shed no tears for him. But instead I think of all the innocent Iranian civilians who have lost their lives. I think of the US service personnel killed in action, our allies and partners in the region who are being outrageously targeted by Iran, and our British bases which have already faced attack. They did not choose this war. Donald Trump did, and he will bear responsibility for it. We have seen before what happens when an American president launches an illegal war with no idea how or when it is going to end, and we fear for what comes next. So in discussions with the White House, has the Prime Minister demanded to find out what Trump's plan is for what comes next? Does the Prime Minister understand that when he fails to stand up to Trump, especially when he breaks international law, it makes our country less safe? And how will the Prime Minister be sure that defensive operations from UK bases will not become offensive? And in rightly protecting our allies in the region, can we be assured by the Prime Minister that he won't follow Trump's lead down a slippery slope into a protracted conflict? And finally, Mr. Speaker, we rightly expect our brave armed forces to protect British citizens around the world in crises like this. But that includes tax exiles like Isabel Oakeshott and washed-up old footballers who mock ordinary people who stay in the UK and pay our taxes here. So as we protect them, does the Prime Minister agree it is only right for tax exiles to start paying taxes to fund our armed forces just like the rest of us do?
Well, can I thank you for his question and agree that the response of Iran has been outrageous, particularly hitting countries which played no part in the strikes on them. We have had extensive discussions with the United States at all levels, including the military-to-military level, continually over the course of the weekend. We deliberately took the decision not to join the offensive strikes that were carried out by the US and Israel. We did take the decision to take defensive action, firstly ourselves on Saturday with putting pilots in the sky, and secondly by allowing the bases to be used for purely defensive reasons. And we clearly set out the legal basis upon which we took the second of those decisions. And in relation to the limits, they are limited to defence, and that is the base upon which we've agreed the basing. And in relation to his last point, I want to be clear that it is my duty, our duty, to protect all UK nationals in the region, and we will endeavour to do everything we can in order to do so.
Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Manjit Singh Desai.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Iranian regime, including its late leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, are of course no friends of our country, but I thank the Prime Minister for clarifying that the UK had no involvement in the Israeli and US strikes on Iran. And indeed, my heartfelt condolences to all those who have sadly lost loved ones in the region thus far. And I'm extremely concerned about the safety of the millions of people in the region, including the thousands of Brits who are living there and currently stranded there. So can the Prime Minister please confirm what steps are being taken to ensure their safety, especially from the one-way attack drones? What steps are being taken to help evacuate those Brits who are stranded and want to come back to the UK? And what steps are being taken with our allies to help de-escalate the situation?
In relation to the protection of our citizens, obviously we're still operating and we will continue operating defensively in the air in the region, taking out the missiles and the drones and the strikes, and we have permitted the US basing specifically for the purpose of taking out Iran's ability to launch the strikes in the first place, and the US has the capability to do that in particular. On the question of our citizens and their desire, understandably, to return home as swiftly and safely as possible, we're doing all that we can, working very closely with our partners in the region, and I would ask all those in the region to register their presence so we can give them the best advice as quickly as possible as to how we can keep them safe and bring them home as quickly as possible.
Father of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
Well, whilst many of us believe that we should be guided by the law of national self-interest, not so-called international law, does the Prime Minister agree that we are right to be cautious in this matter, that the British public will warmly support him in defending British people and bases, but they're very sceptical about being dragged into the cesspit of Middle East politics? They remember Iraq, which some of us voted against. They remember all the arguments about weapons of mass destruction. What evidence, actually, is there that Iran was on the cusp of acquiring nuclear weapons? And since when has regime change from the skies ever changed the regime?
Let me thank him for his question. This government does not believe in regime change from the skies, and I thank him for his question. The lessons of history have taught us that it is important when we make decisions like this that we establish there is a lawful basis for what the United Kingdom is doing. That is one of the lessons from Iraq. And that there's a viable, thought-through plan with an objective that can be achieved or has a viable prospect of being achieved. That is the principles that I applied to the decisions that I made over the weekend. They're the principles I applied to the decision not to get involved in the offensive strikes of the US and Israel. They're also the principles I applied separately to the separate decision and a separate request from the US to be able to take defensive action in order to hit the launchers for the missiles that are currently going into allies, countries in the region, and currently threatening our citizens and our service personnel. And I stand by both of those decisions. I repeat, I am not prepared to commit our military service people to action unless I am sure that what they're doing is lawful and has a viable basis. We can discuss what the law is on another occasion, but the law is what it is, and they deserve to know that their Prime Minister cares and pays attention to whether what I'm asking them to do is lawful, and I will always do that.
Diane Abbott, Mother of the House.
The Prime Minister will be aware that very many of our constituents remember the Iraq War. And they would have noted the similarities between this war and the Iraq War, both in the Middle East and both illegal. Of course, this regime, the current regime in Iran, is a horrible regime, violent, murderous, and a threat to international order. But does he accept that our constituents are not prepared to see this country dragged into another war in the nature of the Iraq War?
Can I thank her and assure her that we do need and have learnt the lessons of Iraq, which is why I've been so clear there must be a lawful basis and a viable, thought-through plan. In relation to our nationals, I think everybody and all of our constituents would expect our government to take action to protect British nationals. We have 300 British nationals in the region. They are at risk. We've already seen strikes on hotels and airport, hotels where our British nationals have been staying. We've had strikes near military bases within hundreds of yards of our personnel. It's our duty to take the action that we can take and will take to protect them.
Sir Oliver Dowden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the Prime Minister has outlined that the Iranians attacked a United Kingdom sovereign base at Akrotiri, why does that not form the basis for legal military action against the Iranians, not just hosting US forces on our bases, but taking direct action at source against the launch of such missiles, as we did in relation to the Iranian proxies, the Houthis, in previous conflicts that he supported? Moreover, given the Iranians' ability to exercise malign influence on the streets of this country, what reassurances can he give the House and the public at large about coordination across our intelligence and security capabilities to address this heightened threat on our streets?
In relation to the second point, can I tell them there is coordination going on for that very reason? As I set out in my statement, there have been 20 Iranian-backed plots to take action on our streets, all of which have been thwarted, and I pay my respect to our security and intelligence services in the work that they do. In relation to the point he makes, there were two separate decisions made over the weekend. We are in the sky taking action defensively on our allies. Among the reasons we agreed to the request from the US yesterday is because they have the capability to take the missile launchers out in Iran, and that is why we gave them the permission to use our bases in order to reduce the threat to our citizens.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has spoken about possibly repatriating British citizens in the region. Can he tell us whether this will be through the MOD, and if so, who will foot the bill? Will it be the MOD, the Treasury, or those who are being repatriated?
We're working across all departments in relation to repatriation, and at the moment we're simply focused on working with our allies to get a plan together to get people out in the first place and to do it as quickly, safely as possible, and there's no intention to charge people for that.
Sir Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's reaction at the end of last week appeared to many to be both anemic and disappointing, and at variance with the other Five Eye nations. Yeah. Will he read the analysis of the shadow attorney, the noble and learned KC Lord Wolfson, which shows not only that British active engagement and support is within international law, but that those who seek to use international law to constrain us in these circumstances have the effect of leaving tyrants and murderers in place to continue perpetrating their vile deeds with impunity? Excellent.
Mr. Speaker, we obviously coordinate with our Five Eyes partners. We were dealing with a specific request to take action, and that was important that we applied the principles that actually have been applied by successive governments, which is to ask the question and get legal advice on the question: is there a lawful basis for what is proposed, and does it have a viable, thought-through plan? It's not a legal question. It's about exposing our military personnel to action that risks their lives, making sure that it is lawful before we ask them to do that. I think that is the duty of the Prime Ministers, and previous Prime Ministers have taken exactly the same approach. I will, of course, read the Shadow Attorney's advice, but I'm very clear in the advice that I received, and I will not commit our military personnel to unlawful action. That is not what they would expect and deserve. They are entitled to better than that.
Donald.
As others have mentioned, that from Iraq to Afghanistan to Libya, I think many of us know the way this goes. And there are responsibilities on all of our shoulders. And the Prime Minister is right, there needs to be a plan. Has the US President shared with him or consulted with him on what the plan is? Because from our experience we know it's easy for politicians to start the war and fire the weapons. It's when the shooting ends, the nightmare begins.
Yes, exactly.
That's why we need clarity of our role as a country, an independent country, not necessarily swayed even by Donald Trump. And can I say to him, when he stood for the leadership of the Labour Party, he very clearly set out that there would be a vote in this House on any decision about military action. Can I ask him to assure us, so that we don't drift into this war as we have in the past, that there will be a vote in this House?
Can I thank him? And he's right to urge caution. History teaches us that, and that is why it's important not only that there's a lawful basis, but there is a plan that is viable and thought through. And obviously, we've had discussions at all levels with the US in relation to that. In relation to the decision I took yesterday, I'm very clear what the lawful basis in relation to the protection of our nationals is. On the question he raises about a vote, that is, of course, a vote on offensive action deploying our troops or military, and that is not this situation.
Carmichael.
You will recall that in 2003, this House voted to support George Bush's war in Iraq, and that 10 years later then we voted against supporting Barack Obama's intervention in Syria. I believed and still believe that on both occasions we made the wrong decision, but it was of critical importance for the political and even the social cohesion of this country that these should be decisions made in this chamber. Mr. Speaker, the people of the United Kingdom will not support an intervention that does not have a clear objective and a clear plan for post-conflict period. Will the Prime Minister be guided by these principles, and will he ensure that this House is given its place in whatever is handed to us in the weeks and months to come?
Well, of course, this House must hold accountability and debate on this issue. But just in relation to the vote, there is no convention for a vote in relation to defensive action, only offensive action. And nor could there be, realistically. Defensive action has to be taken at very swift notice. On Saturday morning, I had to take the decision to deploy our pilots to the sky in order to defend our UK nationals. There is no way we could have waited for a debate or vote in the House. Equally, last night I had to take a decision about the deployment and use of bases, and to do that when it was important to do it as a matter of some urgency. But I agree with him, there must be a full debate in the House, but actually the vote in the House is in relation to deployment of military personnel for offensive action, and that is something I have advocated.
Abdusam Mohammed.
Mr. Speaker, I have constituents and family in the region, all terrified about what may come next. The world is infinitely a more dangerous place today than it was last week. Trump and Netanyahu chose to throw away diplomacy and launch a direct attack on Iran, an attack which, as the Prime Minister has said, can never be justified under international law. Equally, Iran's indiscriminate attacks on airports and hotels across the Gulf are also flagrant violations of sovereignty and clear breaches of international law. Does the Prime Minister recognise that this regime change attempt, like so many others before it, will only result in years of instability and conflict in the region, And what assurances can the Prime Minister give that the UK's involvement will remain in defence and will not turn into full-scale military involvement as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya?
Can I thank her for her question and be absolutely clear about the basis upon which the request was acceded to yesterday? It was the collective self-defence of our allies and the protection of British nationals. That remains the case. If it changes, I'll of course make a different decision and inform the House, and therefore she can rest assured that that's the basis of the action that we've taken and will remain the basis of the action that we've taken.
Sir Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. British influence in the Middle East is directly linked to the strength of our military and our willingness to use it. When he took office, the Prime Minister rightly increased defence spending, but that sum is now widely thought to be too little and taking too long. So will he unlock the argument between the Treasury and the Ministry of Defence so that this House can always have confidence that we will maintain a military formidable enough to defend our borders, our interests and our values?
Yes, we're working at speed on that, and it's an important point, and it's important that we do so. I would remind the party opposite that they hollowed out our armed forces. It was this government that increased defence spending in the course of this Parliament.
Rogan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the weekend, I passed through Dubai Airport, and along with thousands of other people and many of my own constituents, as it turns out, boarded a flight home. Shortly after leaving, we heard the news that this attack had happened. And my immediate thoughts went to the people that were still in the airport, that were then grounded and stuck there, not knowing where to turn or what was going to happen. Now, rather than the blatant aggression and angry sneers that we're seeing from some of the opposition, would the Prime Minister agree that what we need in this situation is calmness and a clear and strategic plan? That is what our constituents want.
Can I thank, and I'm sure that's what our constituents do want. Can I also say how concerned I think we all are across the House at the attacks on hotels and airports in particular. These are hotels that British nationals and others are using, and airports, of course, that civilians are using. This is the extent of the strikes by Iran and the reckless disregard for civilian life that comes with the targets they're working through.
Sir Olney.
The people of Iran have suffered decades of atrocities under the rule of an oppressive regime. However, as we've seen from Iraq and from Libya, the removal of an evil head of state without a future plan for governance can lead to countries becoming failed states. So while I welcome the Prime Minister's reluctance to involve the UK in another protracted war in the Middle East, I remain unclear on the government's vision for the region. I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, does he want regime change? Have his officials contacted the leading opposition figures, such as Reza Pahlavi, to arrange such contingency plans? Or does he wish to negotiate a diplomatic solution with the current regime?
Mr. Speaker, the immediate plan is obviously to take the necessary measures to protect our nationals. And look, no, I don't think anybody mourns the death of the Supreme Leader. I firmly believe that ultimately the only way forward is a negotiated outcome. Whatever the conflict going on, in the end it will have to end in a negotiated outcome. And that has been the consistent position of both parties for a considerable period of time.
Polly Billington.
So far, we have rightly been focused on defending and protecting British citizens in the region. Can the Prime Minister confirm, though, that he believes that the future of the Iranian government is a matter for the Iranian people and no one else? And can we, as soon as possible, focus our diplomatic efforts on de-escalation and peace, including identifying allies in a coalition of the willing to bring this to an end?
Can I strongly agree with her that the future for Iran is for the Iranian people, and we must absolutely establish that as a founding principle, and that it is our duty to de-escalate in the region and globally. And of course, it's really important that we're acting with our allies, and that's why I was talking to both the Germans and the French over the course of the weekend on a number of occasions.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. For those of us who were ready to go into Iraq just over 20 years ago, the comparisons between this and that vote are absolutely zero. The reality is nobody is talking about ground troops, nobody is talking about a land invasion. What we're talking about here is striking those targets that are targeting our friends and allies. Now, in the last few hours, we know of over 500 rockets that have struck the United Arab Emirates, and no doubt many have struck bases around the area. Will he be deploying Dauntless and Duncan out to the Gulf right now? They're both at a state of readiness, and I'm sure the Defence Secretary could give that order this afternoon. And perhaps most importantly, what conversations has his honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, had with colleagues in the region? Because we talk about solution in conversation with others. But frankly, at the moment, it looks like there will be conversation with nobody, because these events will be happening without us having any part in them.
Thank you for his question. Nobody is making the comparison with Iraq. There is a question of drawing the lessons from Iraq. And the lessons I draw is that there must be a lawful basis for the action that we take, and there must be a viable plan. On the question of the operational matters, I won't go into that across the dispatch box. As for his point about the Foreign Secretary, at all levels, including the Foreign Secretary, we've been talking intensively to our allies over the last few days, intensively. And they've been extremely grateful for what we've done and the way in which we have engaged. I've spoken personally to all the leaders in the region, so I'm not sure what point he's making about us not being involved. They are very grateful for the way that we've involved, and the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary have worked round the clock in the last few days to ensure that all the necessary conversations are had, as he would expect, and I think he probably knows has been happening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for setting out clearly the reasons why Britain did not join the US and Israel's attacks on Iran? Can I also thank him for ensuring the defence of Britain's Gulf partners and protecting the 300,000 Britons in the region? I agree with him that a negotiated settlement and diplomacy is the best path to peace. Can the Prime Minister outline the role Britain is playing to ensure that the Iranian people are listened to so that they have peace and security ahead, not more war and chaos, not another murderous Iranian regime, and not another US-imposed regime change?
Well, I thank you for a question, and we've been very, very clear in relation to the future of Iran, that it must be for the Iranian people, and that in the end, the question of nuclear weapons will have to be negotiated, and so we will also always ultimately have to get to that point.
Stephen Gaffin.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will understand why the ghosts of Iraq do hang heavy over this chamber at times like this. And on that basis, does he agree with me that the best tribute to the murderers in Tehran and the Iranian regime is a maintenance of an international rules-based system? And more than that, we owe it to the people across
I took last night, that is to take the necessary measures to protect British nationals, and we're clear that in the end there has to be de-escalation and a return to negotiation.
Alex Ballinger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the PM for his restraint in this operation so far, and not heeding the calls from the Leader of the Opposition to get us embroiled in the reckless US and Israeli strikes on Iran. I still remember interventions in the region, colleagues not returning from Afghanistan, friends who were shot down and tortured over Iraq, and the massive destruction that we've seen to civilians. So will the Prime Minister commit to limiting UK personnel to defensive operations to protect our citizens and our allies, and not get us further embroiled in this unwise and dangerous war?
Yes, I can, and I can absolutely assure him and the House that there will always be a lawful basis for any actions that we take, and there must be a viable plan for it.
Rebecca Smith.
Speaker. Over the weekend, I heard from families in my constituency whose loved ones, also my constituents, are amongst the 300 service personnel in Bahrain who are within metres of the Iranian missile strike. Now, given we have known about the US force build-up in the region for some time, why did the activity to decommission HMS Lancaster in Bahrain continue? And I trust this is not an operational question. Will the works be paused and service personnel withdrawn until the threat status has been downgraded?
Well, I thank her for her question. In relation to her constituents, can I ask her, if they haven't already done so, to ask them to register their presence as quickly as possible, so that we can give them the necessary advice, because this is about how we get people coming out in the coming days. There are obviously wider questions in the region, but it is very important that we take the necessary measures in the coming days.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and now this illegal war on Iran. The reality is, time and time again, we are dragged into conflicts that are illegal, make the region less stable, and result in devastation and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women and children. Have we not learnt the lessons from the past? So will the Prime Minister make it clear from that dispatch box, firstly, Britain is not Trump's poodle, and never again will we be a launch pad for illegal and endless wars that have no plan and no end, and will he make it clear that any final decision will be made by this House?
Can I thank him for his question and give him and the House my assurance that I will always act in the British national interest? That's the basis of the two decisions I took this weekend.
Harding.
Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister confirm the exact limits of defensive operations and guarantee that these limits won't change? And will the UK withdraw consent to use our base if there are proof that they are being used to carry out offensive missions by the US?
The basis is collective lawful defence in relation to our allies. The purpose is to take out the ability of Iran to carry out the strikes that are currently being carried out across the region and threatening British nationals, and the actions from our bases will of course be monitored, as she would expect.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, can I associate myself with the comments of the Prime Minister in giving thanks to our brave armed forces who are serving right now? I have constituents in South Derbyshire, and I'm sure we all do across the country, who look at their TV screens and at their social media and see some world leaders who appear reckless, both internationally and domestically, overseeing what looks like state-sponsored murder of people in their own country. So can I thank him for his cool head in this engagement, and can I please implore him to continue exactly as he is, taking all the evidence into account and making decisions that are within the law and putting the interests of our British citizens, both in the countries that are under attack and in the region and at home, at first and foremost.
Can I thank her for her question? I've set out the principles on which I've taken the decisions that I've taken this weekend. We keep uppermost in our mind the protection of our citizens and nationals who are in the region. There's 300,000 of them. They are at risk, and it's very important that we do everything we can to keep them safe and secure.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The truth is this dreadful Iranian regime has been a permanent threat to British interests, British citizens, both domestically and abroad, attacking us, they're spreading their extremist ideology. And surely the Prime Minister understands that actually the United States and Israel has done the West a huge, huge favour in degrading the military capability of this terrible regime. And does he not understand that after 10 years of negotiation that have failed, actually the West was left with no alternative? And does he understand also that actually, in refusing to support the US, he has humiliated us on the international stage?
Can I agree with him that the regime is abhorrent for all the reasons that I've already set out? But I think he's saying that because of that, it is perfectly right for a British Prime Minister to deploy and take action which would not be lawful. I simply and fundamentally disagree. I think it's a very important principle when we're talking about our personnel that we ensure that what we're asking them to do, and they're being asked to put their lives at risk, that we ensure that it is lawful. I believe in that fundamentally. I'm surprised if he doesn't.
Member Chorlong.
In his statement, the Prime Minister mentioned the drone attack on RAF Akrotiri and the UK's support for the security of friends and partners in Cyprus. Can he tell us how the UK is coordinating efforts with the Cyprus government to ensure the safety of the whole island, including the bases?
Can I assure him I spoke to the President of Cyprus yesterday, and I'm hoping to speak to him again later today. Can I repeat what I said earlier, because it's important for reasons that he and the House will understand. The bases in Cyprus are not being used and not going to be used by the US. And it's very important. Why not? Because they're not suitable. But it's very important that that is made clear, because the President and I have been discussing that, as he will understand.
John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, Prime Minister Carney said Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from threatening international peace and security. Why was our Prime Minister not able to make the same statement? Was Prime Minister Carney wrong?
Look, I'm not trying to pick divisions between our allies on this. I was presented with a different scenario, which is whether we should accede to two requests in relation to action to be taken. That is different, and that requires careful consideration of both the lawful basis and the viable plan. That is the basis on which I took the two decisions that fell to me. Different decisions fall to other Prime Ministers.
Tony Vaughan.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for his careful response to this issue and his ongoing commitment to the international rule of law. My constituents' parents, Lindsay and Craig Foreman, are currently serving an appalling and unjustified 10-year sentence of imprisonment in Evin Prison in Tehran. Other governments have given detailed instructions to their nationals as to what to do if Evin's prison gates were to open and order breaks down. So first of all, will the Prime Minister confirm that a plan covering that situation will be communicated to them to ensure their safety? And secondly, has the government impressed upon the US and Israel the importance of not targeting Evin Prison as Israel did last year, given that the lives of 2 British citizens are at stake?
Well, can I thank him for raising this case and assure him that we have been and will continue to take all necessary action to safeguard their interests in relation to this case.
Dr. Ross Savin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. RAF Fairford is in my constituency of the South Cotswolds. The government has now authorised the US Air Force to use RAF Fairford for defensive operations. Residents have been contacting me today, understandably concerned for their safety, especially given the recent events at RAF Akrotiri. Given that the Prime Minister has pledged to prioritise the safety of UK citizens, what assurance can he offer specifically to the people of Fairford that their safety and security will be fully protected now that UK air bases may be used in operations targeting Iran?
Can I thank her for raising that and assure her and her constituents that all necessary measures are being taken to keep her constituents safe in relation to the use of the base in her constituency. That is a first order priority for us, and that's what we're doing.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is right to be clear that UK military action has to be in line with international law and that we were not involved in Israel and the US's offensive action. He is also right to act to protect British lives and British interests in the face of Iranian attacks. Let me ask the Prime Minister, in rightly drawing lessons from Iraq, does he agree that a failed state in Iran is not in the interests of the UK and not in the interests of the wider Middle East?
I mean, we do have to learn the lessons, and collapsing and failed states have historically proved to be worse, so we do have to be careful.
Sir Julian Lewis.
If a missile battery in Iran was continuing to target British bases, would an airstrike against it be offensive or defensive?
Mr. Speaker, I think I've made clear the base of this. The second decision, we have authorised the US to use our bases in order to take out the ability of Iran to make those strikes. That is legal because it's a collective self-defence.
Sir Zan Joseph.
Mr. Speaker, Iran's reckless attacks have fuelled further regional instability, putting British peoples at risk, along with our allies across the region. The attacks have naturally caused concern about what they mean for our own national security due to the rising oil prices, the cost of living. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the UK continue to act decisively in our own national interest, including how these conflicts can impact every household in our country?
Can I thank him for that question? We're very concerned about the wider impact, and that's why it's important that we continue to argue for de-escalation and a return ultimately to negotiation.
Dr. Elijah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My party and I stand with all the brave Iranians who condemn the vile regime in Iran. We also condemn the deeply irresponsible and illegal attack by the US and Israel on Iran, launched in the middle of nuclear negotiations led by Trump, a clearly unstable loose cannon, and Netanyahu, a war criminal. The UK must stand unequivocally against this reckless action. So will the Prime Minister publish the legal advice he received on the initial American and Israeli strikes, not just the more recent advice on the defensive posture, and will he commit to a vote in this House on any UK involvement in this war?
We are not at war, and we are not getting involved in offensive action that the US and Israel are taking. We've published a summary of the legal advice in relation to the decision that we took last night. That is in accordance with practice. It is not practice to publish legal advice or summaries in relation to defensive action.
Liam Bann.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the diffidence that we've heard towards international law this afternoon is unwise, as perhaps it is unsurprising. But just for the sake of clarity for the House this afternoon, can the Prime Minister confirm what would have needed to be true for it to be legal for him to have joined the offensive strikes last week? Because surely that would have required an imminent threat to our national security, which was simply not present when the decision to strike was taken.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I resist setting out the full international law test, but it is clear what the test is. I think that's not disputed, and as far as I know, nobody is challenging the Attorney General's advice that was the summary of which has been published for all to see. I don't think anybody's saying that's the wrong advice. But I will look at the Shadow Attorney General's advice. I will be surprised if he advises that it would have been unequivocally lawful to have joined the initial action. But if the Leader of the Opposition will give me that advice, I will carefully consider it.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Speaker, may I take the Prime Minister back to his earlier position, where I think his own side does not quite realise what he has said. The Prime Minister said his reason originally for not allowing Fairford, for example, or even Diego Garcia to be used, was that would constitute for him a breach of international law because it would be us condoning an offensive operation. However, he's changed his position on this because of attacks on allies and on a UK base. And that means now that he is authorising the Americans to act in defence by taking out those kind of missiles that would attack us. Surely that now means that the UK armed forces, in this case the Royal Air Force, could now be used by the government in no breach of international law in a defensive action to take out those missiles as well.
There are two separate considerations, obviously. The first is the decision to whether to join the US and Israel in the first place, and the second was the decision we took last night. We started taking defensive action on Saturday by deploying our pilots to the skies in the region. So we'd already taken that action. We added to that defensive action last night by permitting the US to use our bases to strike at the capability of Iran to issue the strikes in the first place.
David Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It has been heartening to see the scenes of jubilation from Iranians from Syrians and from British Iranians in this country at the death of the evil Ayatollah. They hope it will enable them ultimately to finally gain their freedom from this horrific regime. As the situation evolves, could I ask the Prime Minister to please keep them in his mind's eye and engage and meet with some of the Iranian activists that reside in the UK? And in addition, can I ask that if it does look as if the regime is going to fall, officials can think about the ways in which we can support the Iranian people to rebuild their institutions, their infrastructure, provide aid, just as we are currently doing in Syria.
Can I thank him? We must be absolutely clear that the future of Iran is for the Iranian people who've been brutally repressed for a very, very long time, including the terrible actions that were taken in January of this year.
Richard Ford.
Mr. Speaker, in his statement, the Prime Minister explained his disagreement with the US President about UK participation in the initial strikes, and I commend that decision. When the UK refused to participate in US interventions in Vietnam and Grenada, Harold Wilson and Margaret Thatcher kept their disagreements private, but that's difficult to do with Trump. But crucially, over Vietnam and Grenada, the UK stayed out. Can the Prime Minister assure the House that in the case of Iran, the UK isn't going to get dragged into this war on the basis of collective self-defence in support of allies in the Gulf?
Well, I hope I've set out my position clearly and the reasons behind my decision. That is the basis upon which we made the decision last night. We'll keep it under review, and if it changes, I'll come back to the House.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard this language before. Military intervention dressed up as necessity or out of humanitarian concern. Libya, Iraq, and the list goes on. All of those led to devastating consequences of people who live there, hundreds and thousands dead, infrastructures destroyed, countries and regions destabilised, and a creation of a refugee crisis. And I hope that all of those who are chomping for this war will welcome the extra refugees that will be coming onto our shores in light of these particular consequences. Article 51 of the UN does not allow for regime change. And I'm so grateful for our Prime Minister for not going and joining in this illegal war by US and Israel. So can I ask the Prime Minister please to continue with this direction so we don't get involved in another illegal war in the Middle East?
I can assure her in the House I'll apply the same principles of whether there's a lawful basis and a viable case to the decisions that we take.
Shirley Shelbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure I welcome the Prime Minister's comments about working with religious communities, trying to ensure safety. But I was appalled, but I'm afraid not shocked, I'm sure the Prime Minister was as well, to see once again the Deputy Leader of the Green Party at the weekend protesting in support of the Ayatollah. And I'm afraid that the Green Party has become a magnet for all of the people that he, quite rightly, kicked out of the Labour Party. And the hatred and the fear that runs through Leeds now, being whipped up at times by Councillor Mothin, is a disgrace, and West Yorkshire Police have begged Leeds City Council at times to have a named person to hire spaces which Leeds City Council run. And they wouldn't do that. And the reason the police wanted that because they can hold somebody responsibly. My Jewish community, Prime Minister, are terrified going into Leeds at the weekend. So may I ask the Prime Minister, will he ensure that he works closely with all policing authorities to ensure that my Jewish community and other communities can be safe?
Well, can I thank him for his question? And I think we're all shocked by the actions of the Deputy Leader of the Green Party, perhaps not surprised given their recent turn of direction. And it is important that all of us set our face against anti-Semitism. And I have to say the argument that the Green Party makes that now is the time to get out of NATO and negotiate with Putin over our nuclear weapons is contrary to the British national interest.
Chian Mora. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are direct flights from Newcastle to Dubai and many Geordies in the region, including in the armed forces. So I want to thank the Prime Minister for the steps he is taking to support and protect them, and particularly to acting within international law. Iran is a murderous, despotic state which has frequently threatened and does threaten UK security. But the sight of bombs raining down across the Gulf will not make my constituents feel more secure, especially when the impact on democracy and human rights in the region, and indeed the Iranian regime itself, is, to put it mildly, unclear. So what steps is the Prime Minister taking to bring this conflict, to help bring this conflict to an end and restore some semblance of security in the region?
Can I thank her for raising the concerns of her constituents, and I do understand just how worried they will be, as will all of our constituents who are in the area. That is why it's important that we take measures in the region, as we are doing, to try and take the missiles out of the air, and that is the reason we've given permission to the US to use the basis for the limited and specific purposes that I've set out.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last Friday, the talks in Geneva were apparently making good progress, and there was hope there was going to be some kind of agreement between the United States and Iran. 12 hours later, President Trump ordered attacks on Iran, the first victims of which were a group of school children attending school in the morning. They in no way can be held responsible for anything in Iran, human rights abuses or anything else. In his statement, it's unclear to me under what circumstances US forces will be allowed to use RAF bases. Can they use bases in this country to attack Iran? Can they use RAF Akrotiri for that? And are we, this country, sharing information with the US to further their war aims against Iran? Or could we not instead adopt a stance of trying to bring about an immediate ceasefire in order to prevent further dreadful loss of life across every country in the whole region, and the danger of this escalating into a semi-global conflict?
The uses of the basis for collective self-defence of our allies and to protect British nationals, something I'm sure he would agree with, and specifically to take out the ability of Iran to launch the strikes that are currently going into allied countries and putting our nationals at risk. Can I be clear that we are not using Cyprus for this purpose?
Alex Baker.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and for his leadership. My thoughts are with serving personnel in the region, and also can I mention our armed forces families in Cyprus, some of whom are my constituents. Clear communications from the Ministry of Defence will be crucial in reassuring these families feeling worried and uncertain at this time. In light of the growing threat, can I ask the Prime Minister about the UK's commitment under NATO Article 3 to be prepared? Does he agree with me that we need a total government approach to preparedness, with every minister in every government department clear on their role in meeting our obligations to ensure the UK can face the pressures of this increasingly unstable world?
Well, can I thank her for all she does? And I know she has a lot of military families in her constituency, and she's right to be concerned for them, and I'm sure they will be feeling concerned themselves. And we will ensure that we're liaising very closely with them wherever they are in the region to ensure that we do all we can to protect them and, of course, thank them for what they're doing. On the wider point she makes, it is important that the whole of government is committed to defence and security of the United Kingdom.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister happily says that he has learnt the lessons of Iraq, a misadventure that his party is responsible for. Would he agree with me that the lesson of Iraq is you do not use lethal force?
hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones at countries which did not attack them, including the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, Bahrain and Oman. And overnight, Hezbollah, Iran's proxy in Lebanon, launched attacks on Israel, seeking to escalate the war. Mr. Speaker, there are an estimated 300,000 British citizens in the regions, residents, families on holiday, and those in transit. Iran has hit airports and hotels where British citizens are staying. It is deeply concerning for the whole House and the whole country. And, Mr. Speaker, our armed forces are also being put at risk by Iran's actions. On Saturday, Iran hit a military base in Bahrain with missiles and drones. There were 300 British personnel on the base, some within a few hundred yards of the strike. Last night, a drone hit RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. There were no casualties in this strike. Mr. Speaker, it is important for me to say that our bases in Cyprus are not being used by US bombers. The security of our friends and partners in Cyprus is of critical importance. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear. The strike on RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus was not in response to any decision that we have taken. In our assessment, the drone was launched prior to our announcement. Iran's aggression towards Britain and our interests is long-standing, and that's why we've always ensured that protections for British bases and personnel are at their highest level. Mr. Speaker, it is very clear that the death of the Supreme Leader will not stop Iran from launching these strikes. In fact, their approach is becoming even more reckless and more dangerous to civilians. They are working ruthlessly and deliberately through a plan to strike not only military targets, but also economic targets in the region, with no regard for civilian casualties. That is the situation we face today, and to which we must respond. Mr. Speaker, I've been speaking to our Gulf partners over the weekend. They're outraged by Iran's acts, particularly as they played no part in any strikes, and they've asked us to do more to defend them. Moreover, it is my duty, the highest duty of my office, to protect British lives. That is why we put British jets in the air, Typhoons and F-35s, as part of coordinated defensive operations, which have already successfully intercepted Iranian strikes, including, Mr. Speaker, taking out one drone that was heading towards a coalition base in Iraq, housing UK service personnel. I want to pay tribute to our brilliant servicemen and women, putting themselves in harm's way to keep others safe. And I know the whole House will join me in expressing our gratitude and our respect. But, Mr. Speaker, it is simply not possible to shoot down every Iranian missile and every drone after they've been launched. The only way to stop the threat is to destroy the missiles at source, in their storage depots or at the launchers. The US requested permission to use British bases for that specific and limited defensive purpose, because they have the capabilities to do so. Yesterday evening, we took the decision to accept that new request in order to prevent Iran firing missiles across the region, killing innocent civilians, putting British lives at risk, and hitting countries that have not been involved. To be clear, the use of British bases is limited to the agreed defensive purposes. We are not joining the US and Israeli offensive strikes. The basis for our decision is the collective self-defence of long-standing friends and allies and protecting British lives. It is in accordance with international law, and we've produced a summary of our legal advice, which clearly sets this out. We will keep the decision under review. Mr. Speaker, we are not joining the strikes, but we will continue our defensive actions in the region. France and Germany are also prepared to enable US action to destroy Iran's capability to fire missiles and drones from source. I've been in close contact with President Macron and Chancellor Merz in recent days, as well as President Trump and leaders across the region to that end. Mr. Speaker, be in no doubt, the regime in Iran is utterly abhorrent. In January, they murdered thousands of their own people, the full horror of which is still hidden from the world. For decades, they have sought to destabilise the region and export terror around the world. Their proxies in Yemen have targeted British ships in the Red Sea. They facilitated Russia's attacks in Ukraine. The regime's tentacles have even reached these shores, posing a direct threat to Iranian dissidents and to the Jewish community. Over the last year alone, Iran has backed more than 20 potentially lethal attacks on UK soil, each of which, Mr. Speaker, we have foiled. So it's clear the Iranian regime must never be allowed to get their hands on nuclear weapons. That remains the primary aim of the United Kingdom and our allies, including the US, and ultimately this will have to be achieved at the negotiating table. Mr. Speaker, in this dangerous moment, our first thoughts are with our citizens in the region, friends, family members and constituents. I recognise the deep concern that the situation is causing for those involved and for communities across the country. We're asking all British citizens in the region to register their presence so we can provide the best possible support, and to monitor the Home Office travel advice, which is being regularly updated. Across much of the region, airspace remains closed, and local authorities, they've launched hundreds of missiles and thousands of drones at countries which did not attack them, including the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, Bahrain and Oman. And overnight, Hezbollah, Iran's proxy in Lebanon, launched attacks on Israel, seeking to escalate the war. Mr. Speaker, there are an estimated 300,000 British citizens in the region, residents, families on holiday, and those in transit. Iran has hit airports and hotels where British citizens are staying. It is deeply concerning for the whole House and the whole country. And, Mr. Speaker, our armed forces are also being put at risk by Iran's actions. On Saturday, Iran hit a military base in Bahrain with missiles and drones. There were 300 British personnel on the base, some within a few hundred yards of the strike. Last night, a drone hit RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. There were no casualties in this strike. Mr. Speaker, it is important for me to say that our bases in Cyprus are not being used by US bombers. The security of our friends and partners in Cyprus is of critical importance. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear. The strike on RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus was not in response to any decision that we have taken. In our assessment, the drone was launched prior to our announcement. Iran's aggression towards Britain and our interests is long-standing, and that's why we've always ensured that protections for British bases and personnel are at their highest level. Mr. Speaker, it is very clear that the death of the Supreme Leader will not stop Iran from launching these strikes. In fact, their approach is becoming even more reckless and more dangerous to civilians. They are working ruthlessly and deliberately through a plan to strike not only military targets, but also economic targets in the region, with no regard for civilian casualties. That is the situation we face today, and to which we must respond. Mr. Speaker, I've been speaking to our Gulf partners over the weekend. They're outraged by Iran's acts, particularly as they played no part in any strikes, and they've asked us to do more to defend them. Moreover, it is my duty, the highest duty of my office, to protect British lives. That is why we put British jets in the air, Typhoons and F-35s, as part of coordinated defensive operations, which have already successfully intercepted Iranian strikes, including, Mr. Speaker, taking out one drone that was heading towards a coalition base in Iraq, housing UK service personnel. I want to pay tribute to our brilliant servicemen and women, putting themselves in harm's way to keep others safe. And I know the whole House will join me in expressing our gratitude and our respect. But, Mr. Speaker, it is simply not possible to shoot down every Iranian missile and every drone after they've been launched. The only way to stop the threat is to destroy the missiles at source, in their storage depots or at the launchers. The US requested permission to use British bases for that specific and limited defensive purpose, because they had the capabilities to do so. Yesterday evening, we took the decision